It's a most curious paradox that those philosophers of the 19th century who denied the supernatural origin of man and who insisted that man is simply a part of nature, one of the members of nature, nevertheless set up a state of alienation between man and nature without precedent.
That the two 19th century philosophers who have had the widest influence outside philosophy are Marx and Nietzsche.
It's an attack on Christianity rather than on Christ. He envisages 19th century man to have to stand on his own feet without the support of faith or dogma of any kind is central, is a central kind of starting point to his philosophy.
And of course, as soon as you talk about the revolutionary followers of Hegel, onto the scene marches the greatest revolutionary thinker of the modern era, Karl Marx, because he was one of the young Hegelians. To list the fundamental ideas of Hegelianism that we've talked about, which Marx simply took over and incorporated into Marxism. Among these are, first, the idea that reality is a historical process. Second, that this process changes by a dialectical movement, dialectical change, historical dialectic. Third, that it's all going towards a goal. Fourth, that goal is a conflict-free society. And fifth, that until we get there, we're condemned to remain in one form or another of alienation. Alienation. Alienation.
I am a part of nature. I am something that nature fluked into being, but nevertheless, this fluke is something that nature doesn't care about. It doesn't care about my ego and its future. All that is important to nature is the species. The individual is irrelevant.
Go back to the mid-20th century and the work of the existentialists, Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus and others. Well, they disbelieved in God. I mean, they argued strongly against the existence of God, but they were more serious about it. They weren't just playing at atheism, they saw to the bottom of it. They knew that we have in us a deep desire for fulfillment, truth, goodness, justice. In other words, for God. But since there is no God, then, as Sartre said, la vie est absurde. Life is absurd. Life is meaningless. They knew that there's a tension between our desire for God and God's non-existence. Now, the existentialist ethic was, in the face of this storm, in the face of this terrible darkness, you assert your own freedom, you assert your own will, and you say, nevertheless, I will go on.
We are always involved thus in the task of, as it were, creating ourselves.
I am in the literal sense free now to take all my clothes off or go and jump out of the window, or I can actually do these things. And one thing Sartre keeps stressing is that by pretending that I am not free to do them, I'm falsifying the reality of my own situation.
So I stand on a precipice at any moment and I can hurl myself off.
Richard Dawkins has said something like this. Dawkins says, we are possibly the only planet in the universe in which complex chunks of matter run, pursue others, prey upon others, and some have even become so complex as to think, feel, and fall in love with other complex chunks of matter. That's all love is on an atheistic view, just an electrochemical reaction determined by the brain. It has no moral or ethical significance at all.
There are things that have developed over historical time through a consensus of reasoning, sober discussion, argument, legal theory, political and moral philosophy. These do not come from religion.
First, I think our knowledge of right and wrong is innate in us. Religion gets its morality from humans. We know that we can't get along if we permit perjury, theft.
If morality, a sense of morality, is another adaptive or evolved faculty, the problem is that there are all kinds of things that we're stuck with as a result of evolution. You feel biological urges, you feel the impulse to steal, and yet at the same time you have some kind of innate morality that tells you not to steal. So the question is, I don't understand how, if you take it all as a kind of evolutionary result of evolution, let's put it that way, how it is that you can say morality is over and above other urges. How do you do that?
I feel a pang, I think.
Oh, do you?
Why is this? Not to be grand about it, but what Socrates called his daemon. It was an inner voice that stopped him. Adam Smith calls it sort of an unspoken partner in conversation whose approval we hope to get. Lewis calls it conscience and says it's proof of the existence of God. That's stretching it enormously further than it will go. Why don't we just assume that we do have some internal compass, and that if we didn't, we couldn't be the partially rational mammals that we are?
Rational. All right, that's right. Granted that reason is prior to matter, I can understand how men should come by observation and inference to know a lot about the universe they live in. If, on the other hand, minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry on the meaningless flux of atoms, that is to say, if there's nothing but material, this is the materialistic worldview, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees, close quote. Set aside questions of right and wrong and pangs of conscience to the question of reason itself. If you have a thoroughgoing materialist view of the world, doesn't that tend to represent an attack on reason itself, or at least lower? Why should the work of Christopher Hitchens have any more claim on my attention than the random poundings at a keyboard of a chimp?
I don't think evolution even knows that I'm here, and I don't think that the Big Bang originated with me in mind. I'm sorry to say that I'm not as solipsistic and self-centered and arrogant as the religious would have me be. I don't think that these processes had me in mind or are aware of my presence. Doesn't make me feel that I can go and do anything I want. Why doesn't it? I don't know why it doesn't.
It doesn't care about my ego and its future. All that is important to nature is the species. The individual is irrelevant.
Why it would be wrong for creatures who have considerably complex neurological systems to inflict harm on each other on a naturalistic worldview in the struggle for survival.
Okay, so the question you asked initially was, how can I explain why it's wrong for me to murder when it's not wrong for lions to murder? And to answer that question, all it takes is for me to point out a relevant difference between us, and you've just, I think, said, yeah, all right, so I managed to do that. If we now shift to the question, so what does it take for wrongness to enter the world above and beyond rationality? I think the answer might well be, actually, once we achieve a certain level of rationality, nothing more is taken. Nothing more is needed. The reason it's objectively wrong for me to engage in murder is precisely because there is a reason for me not to do it. A reason that I'm capable of recognizing. What there's reason for me to do depends on what kind of creature I am. Once I become the kind of creature in the evolutionary, process, once creatures evolve that are capable of stepping back from their actions, capable of reflecting about whether or not their behavior makes sense, whether it conforms to standards that they are themselves prepared to endorse, at that point the machinery is in place. And at that point, there are reasons for me to behave in certain ways and to avoid other kinds of behavior. And if you ask, but what makes that wrong?
I'm still not clear as to why these beings suddenly achieve intrinsic moral worth in virtue of having these complex nervous systems that enables them to have self-reflection and so forth.
If you put it as complex nervous systems, it sounds pretty deflationary.
Right.
What's so special about having a complex nervous system? But of course, that complex nervous system allows you to do calculus. It allows you to do astrophysics. It allows you to write poetry. It allows you to fall in love. Put under that description, you ask, what's so special about humans from a naturalistic perspective? I'm at a loss to know how to answer that question. If you don't see why we'd be special and different from everything else in creation, that because we can do poetry, we can write a novel, we can think philosophical thoughts, we can do calculus, and we can think about the morality of our behavior, I don't know what kind of answer could possibly satisfy you at that point.
There are four main traditions within Western civilization to which Nietzsche addressed himself and which he attacked. The tradition of Christian morality, the tradition of secular morality, the herd values, as he called them, the ordinary morality of the mass of mankind, and some at least of the traditions deriving from ancient Greece,
That's right,
from Socrates.
All the positive values of Christianity, turning the other cheek, loving your neighbor as you love yourself, having compassion for those suffering, all these are ruled out of court. So, yes, the first thing then is the attack not on Christ, but on Christianity as really furthering the underdog, furthering the person who cannot stand on his own feet and requires compassion, requires pity, illicitly requires sympathy from the outside.
But why was he against compassion and against pity? Why did he despise those so much?
He's not against them, he does not despise them when they come from the strong person. What he despises is the support of the weak person from outside himself. Whatever that source is, the outside source may be. Whether it's another person, his compassion, or rules or regulations, laws, or whatever. The reason for being against it was his fundamental appeal is to authenticity, to selfhood, to the elan vital, to the life within the person, lived to the full.
Now what about his criticism of secular morality?
That all systems of secular moralities are based on an abstraction from the individual case. They're based on an appeal to a generality. For Nietzsche, the word general is the same as common, and by common he means common in the nasty sense of the word. And therefore, in a sense, all rules and regulations, one might almost go as far as saying all laws, are for him matters for the common herd and no more. And now we're, of course, already on the third point that you made, the point about the common herd.
Yeah.
He's most emphatically not a democratic philosopher. He is a philosopher of the great and the noble people, the heroic kind of philosophy, and therefore for him the appeal of democratic ideology is very, very low indeed.
But he did start adult life as a classic scholar.
Yes, I think
professor of classics. He knew about ancient Greece and became deeply critical, didn't he, of the whole tradition deriving from Socrates.
Yes, when Euripides, Aristophanes, and Socrates come on the scene, what happens there is that strength and goodwill and warmth and beauty are replaced by reason, are replaced by rationalizing things by the Socratic argy-bargy. He never forgave Plato, so to speak, for bringing up a hero whose main qualities are those of talking everybody else into the ground.
You cannot shoot a rape sequence which ever shows female genitalia in a film which is going out on general release because it would be described as pornographic. What is frightening about your movie is it's so bad and it cost $9 million. The dialogue is something which you wouldn't give an amateur dramatic group in Toxteth in the Marsh. The acting is wooden. You have a wonderful presence in Bronson who I don't think has ever really been very well used. You have a dreadfully wooden Jill Ireland saying lines which in an English accent grate on the ear. Very uneven cinematography, very uneven music. It's a bad movie.
All right, you're most entitled to your opinion, but the public are loving it.
We will. This is the traditional Western opposition. On the one end of the scale to the left here, you have matter, the inert, the clay put into shape by the potter. On the other end of the scale you have spirit, which is intelligence. And these are what the mathematicians call limits. And a limit is something you approach, but you never actually get there. Now, what the 19th century mythology did was to think of all things towards the limit called matter. It said, in effect, there is this dead material stuff. It is energetic, but the energy is unintelligent. It's a kind of roaring mechanical energy like fire or electricity or so on. It is not intelligent. And everything is really that. What we call human intelligence and consciousness are merely complicated forms of this primordial energy. And they are nothing but that. In the same way, we are evolved from lower orders of animals, and I can trace my ancestry to a protoplasmal globule, Poupart says. And, that's what you really are. You're only a complicated protoplasmal globule. Now, do you see the intent behind this mythology? The intent is to deprecate. The intent is, as we say now, to put down the human being, because the human being felt that hitherto he had been put up too far in the wrong way.
Not to imply to state directly that absent a celestial dictatorship that had some supernatural influence over us, yet to be established, by the way, as anything really existent. But without the assumption of it, we wouldn't know right from wrong. We would.
You are a child of God, and the Lord loves you very dearly, but, that's just insufferable, to be put up in that way. You have an immortal soul. Your life is endless, but it can very well turn out to be a life of endless agony when you fry in hell.
I talk to a lot of people during the week, and they're going through struggles and things like that. What can I do to lift their spirits? I believe there's enough pushing people down already. So when people leave one of our services or read one of my books, I want them to leave saying, you know what, I can be better, I can rise higher. So I think it's just trying to speak to somebody one-on-one, not speaking down to them.
And I always wonder, when you say homosexuality is a sin, and there's a bunch of people who clearly are gay who are in your church, you're calling them sinners. I mean, that...
Well, so that
it's the opposite of uplifting, I would think.
It does, but one, I don't necessarily focus on that. I only talk about that on the interviews. The other thing, too, is it seems like in Christianity, sometimes we categorize sin. I mean, pride is a sin. Being critical is a sin. Being negative is a sin. The Scripture even says anything that is not of faith is a sin.
We're all sinners? You'd say we're all sinners?
Yeah, and so I think we say, okay...
homosexuality is not so bad, right?
Well, I don't think it's God's best. Neither do I think...
So my question is, when you're talking to your 45,000 people in your service, and some of them are gay, you're saying to them, you're a sinner.
Well, Shirley, first off, in my services, I don't cover all these issues that we talk about here.
Would you make it clear that you think that homosexuality is a sin?
When I read the Scripture, that's what I believe, that the Scripture condemns it or says it's a sin. But it also says that, lying is, and that being prideful is.
Right, so then you shouldn't lie. But for people who are gay, you're saying, so then you shouldn't be gay? That's what I'm getting confused.
I think that's
you can't choose nothing.
I think that's the big debate, and the Scripture says you've got to work out your own salvation.
You think you can choose to be gay or not gay? You think you choose to be straight?
No, I know I have not chosen to be straight. I feel like that's who I am.
So how could I choose to be gay?
One question at a time.
Oh, sorry.
That was a very serious threat to both Protestants and Catholics. And so it's much better, much more comfortable to have a dead universe than a living universe so everlastingly threatening.
It's just why I consider it to be morally superior to be an atheist, to say I would rather live without that ghastly master-slave mentality.
So then, the mythology of the 19th century, under which most of us still operate, because we operate under it because it has become so plausible. The science out of which this mythology arose has been so effective. It has produced such a marvelous splash of technological marvels.
What is it that makes me the same person, even though every molecule in my body has changed over dozens or more times?
When I look through my photograph album, there's me at 2, and me at 10, and me at 15, and me at 25, and so on. And that's me in each of those pictures. As you can see changes taking place, but we insist that it's one and the same person. What makes it one and the same individual? There are a number of different philosophical theories about that. One obvious suggestion would be it's the same animal. It's the same animal body that you've got there. It starts off small and it grows and develops in various ways, but it's still the same living organism. And so that's what you are, essentially. You are that living organism, and necessarily you go wherever it goes. Notoriously, it runs into some trouble with some thought experiments. Classic thought experiment is the brain transplant thought experiment. We've got two individuals, let's call one Jim and the other one John, say. They are sat down and their brains are removed. We take Jim's brain and we stick it in John's body, we take John's brain and we stick it in Jim's body. Now, simplifying a little bit, okay, let's assume that the brain is what causally underpins your memory, your personality traits and so on. We replumb the brains in, the two individuals wake up, we ask the person in John's body, who are you? They're going to say Jim, because they've got, Jim's brain. The person in Jim's body is going to say that they're John. If you ask them who their relatives are, they'll name the relatives of the person who's in the other body. All of their memories have been moved over, as have their personality traits. Now, that's a scenario we can envisage, and now we test our intuitions. Jim's in John's body, and John's in Jim's body. And if that's true, then you do not necessarily have to go where your body goes. You could swap bodies. You may end up in a different body later on. I know that this is not technologically possible at the moment, but perhaps one day it will be.
The science out of which this mythology arose has been so effective. It has produced such a marvelous splash of technological marvels that its point of view, or the point of view of those scientists who started the whole thing going, has become amazingly persuasive and convincing.
And we didn't evolve to understand quantum mechanics. And therefore it's not too surprising that on scales vastly different than the kind of experience we had as we were evolving as a species, that nature seems strange and sometimes almost unfathomable, certainly violates our common sense, our sense of what is common sense and what's intuition. But as I like to say, the universe doesn't care about our common sense. We have to force our ideas to conform to the evidence of reality rather than the other way around. And if reality seems strange, that's okay. In fact, that's what makes science so wonderful. It expands our minds because it forces us to accept possibilities which, in advance, we may never have thought was possible.
After all, if I can reach into your brain with a very, very subtle instrument, and I can poke about inside and press there, and suddenly, on a certain point when I press it, a world of memory comes to life so vividly that you see it before your very eyes. I remove the instrument, it vanishes. I touch another place. You experience intense pleasure, absolutely unbelievable pleasure. I remove it, the sensation vanishes. Every time I touch inside, you get a sensation externally of intense reality. And I say, after all, I was only just pushing things in your brain. You see what a push-button thing you are? That's it. I can just poke around and you can see anything. But all that's happening is I'm putting a little electrode or something on certain parts of your brain. That's all you are, poor fish. You're just that kind of a sensitive sponge inside your head bone. Well, that gets very persuasive, you see.
I've said that scientists love mysteries, and we do. That's the reason I'm a scientist, because it's the puzzles of the universe that make it so exciting.
And people are therefore in a position, they are prejudiced to favor a mythology that will make out that you are, after all, nothing but something or other.
But if trust is just the brain in one state,
nothing but a kind of complicated neurological jello.
One is that having an experience of undivided consciousness does not tell you what consciousness really is or what its relationship to the brain really is. There's nothing about introspection that leads you to sense that your subjectivity is at all dependent or even related to voltage changes and chemical interactions going on inside your head.
That puts it down, and you say, and you say people who play golf, they're a bunch of idiots who go out on take a walk, and they hit a stupid little ball with sticks.
You have someone like Deepak Chopra, who is for all intents and purposes, a pseudoscientist and a charlatan.
See, there's always a way of talking about something to make it sound terrible.
It's possible to have really wonderful oceanic experiences of consciousness, but someone like Deepak then moves from those experiences to making claims about consciousness giving birth to the universe, that we are the one mind that in which the universe is arising.
Equally, there's a way of talking about something to make it sound great.
Is to actually go beyond that personal consciousness, that ego consciousness, so we can identify with that transcendent reality, which is the source of space, time, energy, and everything else that exists.
Okay.
Now, what do you want to do? Do you want to live your life in such a way that you're always saying to it,
no, there's nothing after death.
You know? Do you want to, is that a good way to conduct things? Or do you want to live your life in such a way that you say, come on, let's go. You see, let's swing this thing. That the person who's anxious, constantly anxious, is the person who is resisting the flip-flopability of things. Life is vibrating. It's going blip, 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 blip all the time. And the anxious person says, God's sake, don't do that. Because, you know, you might do it too much. I don't want to blip like this. It makes me feel nervous. Stop it. And so, as he puts his weight on this blip, blip, he goes like this. You see, it gets tripping. So instead of saying, come on, let's blip, see, let's go, and do this thing, so in exactly the same way, the person who wants to say, well, you're nothing but some kind of chemicals, and they're just a lot of, you're a bag of pus and blood, basically, with a few bones inside.
And fear of death is ridiculous. Accept your destiny. That's what they say.
And that person is doing the same thing, you see, as the person is putting pressure on the flip-flopability of things, and so he gets anxious. And the person who does this, he wants to say, he's always, look, think about your friends and the people who are philosophical and enthusiastic materialists. They're always going to pose themselves as a certain kind of hero. After all, you're just a dreamer, but I face facts. See? I'm a hard-headed realist. And I'm as a matter of fact, I'm an intellectual porcupine. I have my prickles out all over the place, because I'm the kind of person who, in the academic world at any rate, is full of rigor. I ask, what precisely is the evidence about this? And I'm analytical.
The way to get at the nature of any subject matter you're looking at is analysis. And that you can analyze until you get to things that can't be analyzed any further. And those would be logical atoms. I call them logical atoms because they're not little bits of matter. They're the, so to speak, ideas out of which a thing is built up.
I don't like woolly and vague thinking. I like it clear-cut, and you can see that porcupine's bristle going right through like that. See, well, this is a personality type who wants to play that role, whose message in saying all this jazz is, I'm the kind of person who is all dry as a bone, but I believe that that is strength, and that's reality.
So, fine, I believe that humans are just creatures that evolved on this tiny little speck of dust.
I think our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain.
My argument is that we have to avoid pseudoscience and we have to avoid pseudo-spirituality. We have to just become interested in the full spectrum of human experience and talk about it rationally.
And another kind of person says to him, oh, you are intolerable. You're so dry, you're so dull.
You're you're so Deepak, you're so dismissive of subjective experience.
I'm not remotely dismissive
of it. To poetry, to music, to art. So dismissive of subjectivity. I'm saying that the whole universe is imbued with subjectivity.
There's nothing more important than subjectivity.
You rattle. You don't have any juice in you. And what we need is juice. And we need flow. We need lilt and rhythm and gaiety, you see. So that's an opposed mythology. And that's another character part you're going to play. But so we've got to consider these are games.
The mind-body problem is something like this. How do you take atoms and molecules and physical substances that possess no consciousness whatsoever, and from that derive consciousness? That's the classic problem, as I understand it.
That's precisely it. How is it that all of this matter adds up to something as complex and as interesting and as unique somehow as consciousness?
But it seems to me perfectly conceivable that I should exist when my body doesn't.
That works so well in so many other domains, the method of explanation by reduction, trying to explain, take a high-level phenomenon like life and reproduction and give an explanation of it in terms of low-level phenomena such as the molecular biology of DNA and how DNA transmits information, stores information, transmits it from one generation to the next, plays a role in the development of an organism. Eventually one gets a developing organism which grows and reproduces and adapts, and one gets a nice scientific explanation of life. That method works so well in so many domains. What's interesting is when it comes to applying that to consciousness, it seems to some extent we're banging our head against a brick wall. When it comes to some phenomena, such as the phenomena of explaining how it is, the objective phenomena of explaining how it is we react and we talk and we integrate information and so on, those problems which I called earlier the easy problems, right? It seems that the kind of reductionist methods at least have some promise there. When it comes to the problem of explaining why all that physical stuff should be accompanied by a subjective experience, that seems as a different kind of question. It's what some philosophers have called an explanatory gap between the physical level and the level of consciousness. No number, 10 neurons, 100 neurons, 1,000 neurons, 1,000 billion neurons, no matter how complex, nothing in that story seems to tell you why it is that anything should ever have a subjective feeling to it.
We evolved as human beings a few million years ago on the savannah in Africa, and we evolved to escape tigers or lions or predators. And so what makes common sense to us is the world on our scale. How to throw a rock or a spear, or how to find a cave. And
so why do some butterflies have eyes? Well, it so happened that some fluke of a butterfly once got an eye on its wing, and birds would avoid it because that eye looked at them and it was just too much. So those butterflies that had eyes on their wings bred, whereas the butterflies that didn't have eyes got eaten up more easily. Although some of them had other alternatives, because of not having eyes, they were invisible and the birds couldn't see them. And so more of that kind survived, although those with the terrifying eyes survived, and so they didn't get eaten up either. So those, it tended to multiply. So this is a perfectly easy, simple explanation of why butterflies have eyes on their wings. But on the other hand, you can equally well explain it in a completely different way. You can say, it would be exceedingly dreary if there were nothing but one uniform type of life. Now, supposing there had never been anything but amoebas, and they were just globules, and they divided, and then they divided again, and then they divided again. That could have gone on, and it could have been terribly efficient, because the minute you went to hit an amoeba, you would strike it, but suddenly find you'd killed only one of them because it split just before you hit. It's a marvelous arrangement. And they could split very fast. You could suddenly go at another with 2 hammers, hoping to catch both amoebas, but suddenly they split, and there were 8 of them before you knew where you were. That would be fine. But actually, the reason why there is all this colossal variety and all these patterns on butterflies' wings is that nature is a poet and is simply having a wonderful time making all this variety and doing all these various things. And that explanation is just as plausible as the efficient explanation. You see, the philosophy is to a large extent a matter of taste. What sort of explanations suit your personality? If you're an anal retentive type and rather tight, then you like the efficient explanation. On the other hand, if you're an effusive type, you like the poetic explanation. But there are, though, beyond that, certain considerations of which of these explanations affords better games. And the economic anal retentive explanation can give good games up to a point, because there's all the thrill of working out the chains of interconnection, all the reasoning, whereby finally you go through all sorts of rational conniptions and explain why the butterfly has a big eye on its wing. Fine. But where do you end up? You end up in a mechanical straitjacket. You've got to be careful along the other line of approach that you just don't end up in a morass. So you look for a middle way. But the point that emerges from all this is, don't be bamboozled into fearing that the black will win, because the white is the only thing there is, and the black, the nothing that surrounds it, will eventually engulf it. All these are, as it were, nursery stories to terrify children. You live in a cosmos where the light of consciousness and the darkness of unconsciousness go back and forth, just as the crests and the troughs of the waves. And this situation of yang and yin, positive and negative, is exceedingly productive. It's like a male and a female who become the parents of all sorts of children. And out of yang and yin, black and white, come all these adventures through the original stratagem of pretending that the one is and the other isn't, that yang is and that yin isn't. Both have equally good arguments on their side, and one now wins and the other now wins. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But don't be deceived. The two are always together. And the thing that you most fear, the awful, awful thing that could happen, think it through. What could that be? What could the very end be? What is it that you dread? And you'll find out that if you go down, 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 down into what you dread, be swallowed up, be annihilated, let the horrible scorpion, spider mother, the octopus thing catch you and take you down into its inmost guts, what will it do with you? Why, it'll transform you into itself. And then when you are it, as I said, every creature feels like it's a human being. Because after all, that's I. So fish, when they've eaten up something and that thing has become them, and then the fish looks around and says, gee, that was a good dinner. And it feels human. And the fish looks around and it sees things that aren't fish, and they look like cows and human beings wandering around there. They look like predatory monsters of some kind. Awful looking things, ghastly teeth, and weird, inhumane arms and legs on them. Not nice, orderly fins and tails and beautiful scales on the side, like a really good person should look. So, you know, this thing of death and of being transformed is where our life reaches a certain point where it has to go bloop, and in the moment you go bloop, you forget. You lose control, you see? That's the sensation. When control is going, you're just on the verge of the crisis where it's going to bloop, and you say, well, where was I? Gee, this is strange. I'm alive. I don't remember where I was before. That's the sensation of coming to birth. And you grow and grow, and you become more familiar with this and more familiar. When you're completely familiar, it goes bloop, and you're new all over again. See, quite different. We can never believe, you see, when it gets to the point where we know it's about to go bloop, you never believe that it will go into life. We always think it's going to go into something dreadful. But you see, once you know, it's going to keep flipping. And the only thing is to go with that flip. See, get ready to go. Are you ready? Boop. Then you can laugh, because you know there's no way out.